Hello, History 363. So we left off with the Roman victory over the mighty Seleucid Empire. The Romans impose a heavy indemnity of 1,000 talents a year to be paid for every year for 12 years. And the Romans also reward their allies who have helped them in this war. So Rhodes, which had provided the navy that had helped defeat the Seleucid fleet, is given huge chunks of Seleucid territory in Caria. And Pergamon is also given the charge of the Pergamenese cavalry led by the king, Eumenes II, had been a real critical, moment in the Battle of Magnesia. And the Attalids also see their domain radically expanded. So they go from being kings who control a city-state and kind of a very small amount of territory around that city-state to having huge swaths of territory across Asia Minor. The Romans also reward Philip V, who had sided with Rome during the Seleucid War, by reducing his indemnity, seemingly allow him to enlarge his army, and they also allow him to start undertaking, within limits, aggressive warfare. Indeed, he also reoccupies Demetrius, a traditional Macedonian stronghold in Thessaly. So that's sort of his reward. Having rewarded the allies, the Romans largely turned their back from Eastern affairs. And I say not completely. There still continues to be a lot of diplomatic engagement, particularly states in the East that have problems send embassies to Rome. But in terms of armies, in terms of proclaiming provinces that will be the area of operations for praetors or consuls, the Romans largely ignore the East until the start of the Third Macedonian War in 171. This is a reminder that the focus of Roman imperialism is not the Eastern Mediterranean, despite that being the focus of Polybius's narrative. The Romans send most of their armies they send them either in Italy, particularly in northern Italy against Cisalpine Gaul, and they also send them to Spain. Indeed, Spain, where we'll talk about Spain in later lectures, but there's heavy fighting in Spain that involves 4 legions, 2 in each Spanish province, down to 179. In addition to being significant military operations still taking place in Cisalpine Gaul against Celtic peoples living there, and then subsequently against Ligurian peoples who live even further in the kind of mountainous regions to the east. So all of this activity is really the focus of when the Romans have to put armies and commanders, they send them to northern Italy and they send them to Spain, and they're really kind of indifferent to what's happening in Greece other than diplomatic conversations. And even these, Rome isn't willing to go to war necessarily to enforce its will. Philip V, who again has been a Roman ally, uses his late reign to really trying to revive his kingdom. This is what political scientists, including, say, Arthur Eckstein, who borrows heavily from kind of IR theory, call internal strengthening. And this internal strengthening includes reviving silver mines that had been a traditional source of Macedonian wealth, and also trying to improve the Macedonian population by encouraging emigration. So he encourages Thracians and Celts to come into Macedonia and settle there, where they become farmers and also can be recruits for the Macedonian army. And Philip also tries to expand, again, where the Romans will let him. They're kind of cool with operations mostly in the northern Balkans. And so Philip is engaging in this process until his death in 179. He's succeeded by his son Perseus. And Perseus, there's a bit of a violent aspect to his accession, in that Philip had like many Hellenistic kings, has multiple sons with multiple different women. Macedonian kings and Hellenistic kings practice kind of royal polygamy. And Perseus has arranged for the murder of his younger brother before he becomes king, in a kind of set of palace intrigues. Demetrius, and this hapless Demetrius who Philip executes on trial charges of trumped-up treason, is seen as the kind of preferred candidate of the Romans. He's a very pro-Roman candidate, but Perseus gets him liquidated. But once he comes to power, he continues basically with the same policies of trying to expand Macedonian power as he can, particularly in the North Balkans, and of simply strengthening his internal state, including doing things like building up stockpiles of cash, building up stockpiles of weapons and armor. Things that might just be things that a kind of ordinarily responsible king might do, but the waxing power, the revival of the Macedonian state in the 170s first starts to alarm some of Rome's allies, including Pergamon, who potentially feel threatened in a world where Macedonia is getting stronger and stronger, but Rome is indifferent. And so the Attalid send, the Attalid dynasty, send envoys to Rome and say, look, the king is getting really strong. Furthermore, the Romans themselves seem to start taking notice that Perseus is not just simply a good king, but is actually becoming too powerful and maybe too assertive. This kind of returns us to the question, well, why does Rome ultimately go to war with Macedonia for the Third Macedonian War? And indeed, our three kind of historians that we talk about give slightly different answers. Harris sees this as Macedonia basically does nothing wrong. The Romans are just looking for a war and trying to just bash around Perseus. They don't need much of an excuse because they're pathologically bellicose. Gruen has argued that the Romans actually come to regret their withdrawal from Greek diplomatic affairs as Perseus is becoming more diplomatically assertive. One way to sort of re-inject themselves into that Greek diplomacy is to finally take a firm line against Perseus, and taking a hard line against Perseus on behalf of Greek allies, however, is the kind of stance that might lead them to a war. So again, kind of war as an unfortunate byproduct of Roman diplomatic engagement with Greek allies. Arthur Eckstein, who has argued again on this sort of realist policy, says, look, basically, Perseus is getting too strong. This first alarms Rome's allies, and then it starts to alarm Rome, and therefore Rome moves against a potential rival that is revivifying before their eyes. Now again, a little bit of all of these can kind of be true. The Romans can be pathologically bellicose. They can be interested in certain diplomatic objectives and reestablishing kind of good faith towards allies. And Perseus, even though he hasn't done anything particularly bad yet, can nonetheless be seen as a menace by both Greek city-states and eventually by Rome. But it just goes to show that, of course, the causes of war are complex and are a multivariable problem that historians appropriately argue about. So by 171, the Romans and the Macedonians are again at war. The war actually in some ways kind of resembles the Second Macedonian War. The early years are full of kind of frustrations and stalemates. In fact, Perseus scores a victory in a kind of grand cavalry skirmish at Kallinikos in 170 BC, where his Thracians defeat a sort of detachments of Roman cavalry, and the Thracians come back with their sort of weapon is a long kind of curved scythe called a sika, and they come back with Roman heads stuck to their sicae, parading before Perseus. Finally, the Romans elect, in 168, an experienced general, someone who's been consul before, named Aemilius Paullus. He's actually the son of the Aemilius Paullus who had commanded at Cannae and had been killed. So Lucius Aemilius Paullus takes over. At this point, the Romans have made some progress in that they've managed to fight their way into Thessaly. And Paullus fights his way into Macedonia. Indeed, he comes up with a rather kind of bold series of maneuvers where he forces his way into Macedonia by sending a flying column around Mount Olympus, forcing Perseus to withdraw before he can be enveloped. But Paullus is also a very kind of cautious commander. He's sort of willing to shadow box with Perseus and sort of wait for the right moment for a battle. And this frustrates many of his soldiers and actually many of his officers who are really aggressive and just want to fight right away. Paullus has to call an army assembly and yell at them, say, look, I'm in charge, you're not, stop telling me how to win the war. A reminder of the kind of assertiveness that Roman soldiers don't seem to have a problem indicating whether or not they're unhappy with how the war is being run, even though Paullus just tells them to shut up. Finally, however, a battle breaks out near Pydna, where the Roman army is deployed in some kind of low hills. The Macedonian army is deployed facing them. Again, neither side may actually think that a battle is about to be fought. They're both just kind of facing off. I think this is not uncommon for armies in antiquity to sort of face off for a period while both sides decide, do I really want a big set-piece fight today? Here, however, a fight breaks out accidentally, in that a horse or a mule that some pickets on the Roman side have, it escapes. It runs over to the Macedonian side, and the pickets start to fight. Roman pickets are actually mostly Italians, including Samnites, and then some kind of pickets on the Macedonian side, who I think are mostly Thracians. They're starting to fight over this mule, and the skirmish just kind of gets bigger and bigger as more little units kind of get drawn into the fight. And Perseus, seeing that a big battle is about to break out, says, let's just go for it, and orders his whole army to deploy and sends his main phalanx, at this point 20,000 strong, against Paullus's legions. And so now we have a big set-piece battle. Initially, the Romans are forced back. This is a consistent theme if we look at how the Romans fight Hellenistic kings. The array of the Hellenistic king, in this instance, that pike phalanx, men with 20-foot pikes, arrayed in a dense, solid formation, are kind of like a steamroller, pushing the Romans to within a couple hundred yards of the ramparts of their camp. Now, Paullus, who reports that he thinks that later when he's sort of at drinking parties, he'll say, look, the charge of the Macedonian phalanx was the most terrifying thing that I have ever seen. He comes out, and he basically, the battle is won in that Paullus takes advantage of how modular the Roman legion is. Remember when we talked about the Roman legion a couple of weeks ago, it doesn't deploy in a big solid block of infantrymen, but rather individual maniples are sort of arrayed in a kind of checkerboard formation, with the maniples in the rear kind of providing cover to the gaps between the maniples in the front. So it's modular, it's rather fluid, and on one hand, this is vulnerable to the charge of a huge, dense, solid pike phalanx, but it has an advantage if the pike phalanx gets disrupted. And this is what Polybius tells. He says, look, the Macedonians are never going to find a perfectly flat place to fight. And every time that Macedonian pike phalanx, again, terrifying, even unstoppable in its charge, every time it hits a little gully, every time it hits a rock or a stump or a fence or a ditch, it's going to start to break up. Little openings are going to open in this solid phalanx. And into those openings, Paullus sends individual maniples, which kind of, once they get inside the phalanx, can kind of become sort of human Cuisinarts, carving up the Macedonians as the Romans fight with their short swords. Not particularly good against a pike that's 20 foot long, unless you can kind of get inside the pike phalanx. And then it's the Romans who have the advantage in really close combat. And so this is what happens. The phalanx gets little disruptions, the Romans infiltrate it, and then they carve it up so the phalanx rapidly collapses. Indeed, we're told that this battle, which initially looks like a Macedonian victory, is over almost within an hour, as the phalanx is broken up and the Macedonians flee, and the Romans then pursue it. And indeed, Roman cavalry will be hunting down Macedonian survivors in a sort of swath of death that will span kind of 20 kilometers. Overall, the Macedonians, Philip will lose 20,000 men killed, perhaps as many captured, and he himself, his power is broken. He flees and is finally captured in Samothrace, where he surrenders. And here the Romans are kind of done with a conditional settlement. Notice that they've given previously conditional settlements to both Philip V and Antiochus III. Those are not unconditional surrenders. They are not deditio infidem. Philip V and Antiochus III keep their kingdoms. They accept some constraints, but those are conditions. Now, with Perseus, the Romans are going to impose a total settlement. Perseus is going to be taken back to Rome as a captive. He's paraded in Paulus's triumph. And then he's sent off as a prisoner to the Roman colony of Albufusans, where supposedly he's treated badly and dies shortly thereafter. Meanwhile, so that is the end of the Antigonid dynasty, which has governed Macedonia since the early 3rd century. Macedonia itself is going to be carved up into 4 separate republics. And there are going to be limits placed on these republics. A few of the 2 that are kind of have a border with the to the north, where there are barbarian peoples, are allowed some military forces, but the citizens of each of these 4 new republics can't intermarry. The idea is to actually keep them separate. And the tax that they had previously paid to the Macedonian king, half of that now has to go to Rome. So now that there's going to be a steady payment of silver, about 100 talents a year, being paid into the Roman treasury. So thus ends the Third Macedonian War. And this is actually a really startling end. I mean, Rome previously had kind of left these states. Now Rome is completely disrupting the way that the Hellenistic world looks. It's notable that after the Third Macedonian War and after the destruction of the Antigonid monarchy, Roman imperialism in the East takes a harsher turn. Whereas before, Rome still kind of always needed allies and had to be nice to its allies and considerate to its allies. With the destruction of the Macedonian monarchy, with the Seleucids still relatively weak, and indeed that's right after the Battle of Pydna in 168, there was a Seleucid king, Antiochus III, who was invading Egypt. It's a war just between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. He's invading Egypt, and as he's sort of with his army, right at the kind of Pelusium, right as he's about to enter Egypt proper, a Roman ambassador sails up, gets out of his ship, walks over to Antiochus IV, who's again a pretty big, powerful, important king. Antiochus IV goes to shake his hand. The Roman envoy says, nope. He draws a circle in the sand around Antiochus the king and says, don't step out of this circle until you've decided to withdraw your army from the territory of our friend and ally Ptolemy. And Antiochus IV, he's the son of Antiochus III, has no choice. He's humiliated in front of his own court, his own army, and he withdraws. So that's the sign of how there is no power now that can really dares challenge Rome after the Battle of Pydna. And Rome starts taking it out on some of its allies that were seen as not loyal enough. So, for example, the Rhodians, traditional allies, key naval allies in the war against Antiochus the Great. But the Rhodians have dared to suggest that maybe Perseus and Rome should work things out. This is before Pydna. And the Romans, angers them to no end, and as a result, they declare Delos a sort of tribute-free island. So if you're coming into Italy from Delos, you don't have to pay customs dues. And this destroys the Rhodian economy, because Rhodes had really depended on people coming through Rhodes and paying custom dues before going everywhere. Now everyone just starts going through Delos, because if you're going to Italy, this huge important market, why would you go to Rhodes instead? So Rhodes gets this huge economic punishment. Also, the Romans say, we think that some of the Achaeans have not been as loyal towards us as they could be. So therefore, there's this kind of assize in Achaea, and there's a lot of kind of blacklisting and people, throwing up threats and accusing their political enemies of insufficient loyalty to Rome. And the Romans take 1,000 Achaean statesmen and deport them to Italy, where they're going to be held as prisoners, mostly in various Latin colonies, under a kind of house arrest. One of these prisoners is Polybius. That's how he gets to Rome, as a captive. He's lucky in that early on in his captivity, so he comes to Rome in 167 BC, early on in his captivity, he befriends young Scipio Aemilianus, the son of Aemilius Paullus, although adopted to another family. Scipio Aemilianus had been at the Battle of Pydna, where he'd been taking part in this bloody pursuit. Indeed, for a while had been feared dead. But coming back to Italy, he's still quite young. He becomes good friends with Polybius. Polybius becomes a kind of intellectual mentor to him. But it's Scipio Aemilianus who has the connections and ensures that Polybius doesn't get sent under, off to house arrest in some Latin colony, but instead comes to Rome where he meets the best people, goes through the best dinner parties, becomes a really well-connected part of Roman intellectual society, and that's what positions Polybius to write the history that he does. The Third Macedonian War and the sort of hegemonic severity that Rome displays after is a really important reason why we have Polybius's history in the first place. One final note on the importance of the Third Macedonian War. The Romans bust open the Macedonian treasury, bring back a huge haul of loot, supposedly over 6,000 talents of silver. And as a result, the Romans suspend the collection of citizen tax, so the war tax, tributum, which has been financing Roman warfare this whole time. Citizens literally have to pay money for the privilege of going to war with other people so they can fund the army. That tributum is now canceled. Maybe initially sort of just suspended, but that suspension turns out to be permanent. And this also is a huge shift in the way that Rome finances its empire, going from direct taxation of citizens to now financing the empire from money taken from the imperial periphery. And that actually is a really big and important shift when you think about the kind of fiscal sociology of empire. The Roman citizens, where they may be paying indirect taxes like custom dues or bridge tolls, are no longer paying the direct war tax, the tributum. All right, so that's all for this week. And I think, yes, we've got a midterm coming up. So we will end on that, and we will talk next week. We might have to rejigger where we are on the syllabus, but next week we might take a little pause and talk a little bit about kind of Roman society, issues of slavery, family, women, religion, before we dive back into the narrative blow by blow. So anyway, good luck on our midterm, and I'll see you soon.